Okay, good afternoon. In the course of my 25-year military career, I made many moves that entailed finding a new church to call home. I'd grown to adulthood in the same Methodist church, so finding a new church at my first duty assignment was a daunting task for a young soldier and his new bride. We ended up joining a Wesleyan church not far from our house, and during our 2 years in Kansas, we experienced the birth of our daughter in between several overseas deployments for myself. The pastoral couple of that little Wesleyan church were a blessing to a young couple going through a stressful season of life, set an example of Christian service that shaped our subsequent Christian walk. So, what I'd like to do today is talk about the importance of the Wesleyan denomination in the early history of the United States, particularly how it neatly fits within the scope of readings for this week. During this presentation, I'll provide a brief overview of the early history of the Wesleyan Church, the Wesleyan Connection, and discuss two Wesleyan preachers deeply involved in the abolitionist movement, as, again, their stories fit well in with what we're just reading and discussing this week. Started in 1743, John Wesley consistently condemned the practice of slavery, and so an anti-slavery element was woven into the early Methodist Church established in the United States. When the Methodist Episcopal Church was established in 1784, conference rules specified the expulsion of any member caught engaging in slavery. But as the church grew in the United States, a large number of churches were established in the South. So by 1824, the General Conference officially sanctioned the local church practice of allowing slaveholders to attain certain leadership positions by taking a curious position that slavery was a societal rather than an individual sin. This position naturally outraged Northern abolitionists whose views on immediate abolition, filtered into the Methodist Church, due largely to Reverend Orange Scott of Vermont, who had embraced the immediate abolitionist position articulated in William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. The efforts of abolitionists like Scott to effect widespread change were hindered by Methodist hierarchy, as anti-abolitionist bishops could and did discipline and even revoke appointment of abolitionists. At the 1836 General Conference, bishops publicly rebuked the abolitionist delegate led by Scott, ordering, quote, both ministers and people to refrain from this agitating subject. The next several years saw many abolitionists demoted or fired, and Scott and other like-minded ministers left their parishes to work full-time for anti-slavery groups. This exercise of authoritarian church government grated on the abolitionist-minded local congregations who equated local church freedoms with the American democracy. Thus, for these churches, the hierarchical structure of the Methodist Episcopal Church was viewed as not only undemocratic, but even tolerant of sinful slavery practices. Consequently, a large group of Michigan Methodist Episcopal churches withdrew from the denomination and organized the Wesleyan Methodist Connection on 13 May 1841. Additional breakaway churches from New York and the other New England states followed, and by 1844, the Wesleyan Methodist Connection held its first general conference at Utica, New York. Besides rejecting slavery, the new Wesleyan Connection emphasized the doctrines of Christian perfection and sanctification, actually becoming the first denomination to officially adopt such doctrines. Conscious of the abuses suffered under the old Episcopal hierarchical system, the Wesleyans rejected centralized power over the churches, instead emphasizing the sense of personal responsibility among the individual members of the local church. One major leader of the Wesleyan Connection during this time period was Luther Lee of New York. A self-educated Methodist circuit rider, Lee emerged as a major leader in the region, earning the nickname of Logical Lee for his vigorous doctrinal debates with the Universalists. He brought this same debate skill to defending Methodist ministers facing church discipline over the abolitionist activities, and so naturally earning bishop wrath on Lee. And as a consequence, Lee left the Methodist pastorate and worked for several years in anti-slavery societies, even becoming involved in the anti-slavery Liberty Party. Lee joined the new Wesleyan Connection in 1844 was elected the president of the First General Conference. He did return to pastoring in New York, where he was active in supporting the Underground Railroad, and in addition to editing the denominational newsletter, and even compiled the new denomination's Elements of Theology. In 1846, Lee preached a sermon marking the death of Charles Torrey, a Congregationalist minister, excuse me, and conductor on the Underground Railroad, who died in a Baltimore prison after he had been sent there for his abolitionist activities. Lee held up Torrey as a martyr, and the sermon argued for the righteousness of civil disobedience as, quote, the law of Christ is to be obeyed whatever human laws may exist to the contrary, and whatever consequences may attend obedience. Lee's sermon was used to counter pro-slavery preachers, citing Romans 13:1, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, used to justify slavery. And for many years, Lee's arguments formed a key part of abolitionist doctrine in the pre-Civil War years. Now I'd like to turn to discussing how Wesleyan impulses towards missions and abolition intersected in the time period right before the Civil War. As it was evident, the Wesleyan Connection was largely northern-oriented, but many, quote, come-outer congregations in the South also broke away from the Methodist Episcopal Church and needed Wesleyan pastors. One such circuit was established around Guilford County, North Carolina, in 1847, and actually remained in operation until 1861. The first circuit rider, Adam Crooks, began with those initial 4 churches, and by 1849 had helped organize 20 churches in the Piedmont area of North Carolina and even up into Virginia. Crooks found fertile soil for church planting, as the region actually was home to many disaffected Quakers who had been left church homeless with a large-scale dissolution of meeting houses in the previous decades. Eventually, Crook and his partner Jesse McBride were arrested for distributing abolitionist literature and released on appeal. The two continued to preach until they were ran out of the state in 1851 by a pro-slavery mob. Their work was continued by David Wilson of Greensboro, North Carolina, a former Methodist itinerant preacher who had joined the Wesleyan Connection in 1844. Presumably, Wilson's local connections protected him from retribution for many years. And he's an interesting case, as he was Southern-born, yet was staunchly anti-slavery. Besides continuing to preach the gospel, he advocated for abolition and helped establish the presidents of the American Missionary Association, AMA, a Christian anti-slavery organization in North Carolina. By 1857, dissent over slavery opinions in some of those congregations led to Wilson's removal and the loss of his license to preach by the Wesleyan Connection. Now, he remained in the North Carolina up to 1860 as a representative of the AMA, and then basically with the outbreak of war, he ended up departing the state and eventually settled in Kansas, possibly having a connection with the Wesleyan church that I attended later in life. And he did resume itinerant preaching until 1877. So in closing, the story of the Wesleyan Connection serves as a microcosm of the larger divisions suffered by the Christian denominations over the issue of slavery. And I think it's important to point out Daniel Wilson's example shows that anti-slavery sentiment was prevalent even in the otherwise pro-slavery states in the South, showing that we should be careful of assuming all Southerners were supportive of the institute of slavery. Thank you for your time, and this concludes my presentation for today.